When an empath goes silent, the avoidant feels this first. Introduction. Silence can reveal what words were never able to explain. When an empath finally stops reaching out, stops explaining their feelings, and stops trying to repair every moment of distance, the avoidant may not feel panic first. In fact, the first emotion may be relief. The pressure disappears. There are no difficult questions to answer, no emotional conversations to avoid, and no immediate expectation to open up. But that relief is only the beginning of a much deeper psychological shift. In this video, we are going to uncover what can happen inside an avoidant when the person who was always emotionally available suddenly becomes quiet. You will learn why the first reaction may be completely different from what most people expect, why silence can disrupt an emotional pattern that both people had become used to, and why the absence of messages can eventually create uncertainty where certainty once existed. We will also explore the lesser-known difference between losing someone's attention and losing emotional access to them. You will see how the familiar cycle of one person reaching while the other withdraws can change when the empath simply stops participating. More importantly, we will uncover why an avoidant may begin noticing the silence only after the initial relief fades, and why questions can slowly replace the comfort of emotional distance. But there is an even deeper part of this story. The real psychological shift is not about making someone chase you. It is not about using silence as punishment or trying to control another person's emotions. It is about what happens when an empath stops abandoning their own needs just to keep a connection alive. By the end of this video, you will understand why the most powerful part of an empath's silence may have very little to do with the avoidant at all. You will also understand why the moment an empath stops explaining themselves can change the entire emotional balance of a relationship. So stay until the end, because the final revelation may completely change the way you understand silence, emotional distance, and the avoidant mind. Welcome to our channel, where we explore the hidden psychology behind human behavior, relationships, attachment, and emotional patterns. If you want to understand what people often feel but rarely reveal, subscribe now and stay with us for more psychological insights. When an empath goes silent, the avoidant feels this first. Main script. There is a moment in some relationships when the silence feels almost peaceful to one person and deeply uncomfortable to the other. The messages stop. The explanations disappear. The emotional questions are no longer coming. The person who once tried to understand every change in tone, every period of distance, and every confusing behavior simply becomes quiet. And this is where one of the most misunderstood parts of avoidant psychology begins. When an empath goes silent, the avoidant may not immediately feel abandoned. They may not suddenly panic. They may not reach for their phone and start wondering where everything went wrong. In the beginning, they may actually feel relief. That sounds harsh, especially to someone who has spent weeks or months trying to maintain an emotional connection. But relief does not automatically mean a lack of care. It can mean that the emotional pressure has temporarily disappeared. There is no difficult conversation waiting for them. There is no message asking what happened. There is no expectation to explain why they became distant. There is no immediate need to process emotions that they may already find difficult to handle. For someone with strong avoidant tendencies, emotional closeness can sometimes activate discomfort, especially when the relationship becomes intense or conflict appears. One common response is to create distance from the emotional situation rather than move closer to it. This is sometimes described through the idea of deactivating strategies, where a person reduces emotional engagement, suppresses attachment-related needs, or mentally creates distance from a relationship when closeness begins to feel overwhelming. So when the empath finally becomes silent, the avoidant may experience something that seems almost opposite to what the empath expects. The silence can feel calming at first. The pressure is gone. The relationship suddenly requires less immediate emotional participation. And that creates a powerful psychological paradox. The same silence that feels painful to the empath can initially feel peaceful to the avoidant. But that first feeling is only the first layer. It does not tell you what they will feel later. In fact, this is where the story becomes much more interesting, because when the emotional pressure disappears, another thing disappears with it: predictability. For a long time, the empath may have been the person who kept the emotional connection moving. If there was tension, they tried to repair it. If there was distance, they asked about it. If the avoidant disappeared emotionally, the empath eventually reached out again. If a conversation ended badly, the empath may have returned to explain what they meant. The avoidant could therefore become accustomed to a particular relationship rhythm without consciously realizing it. They pulled away, and eventually the empath came closer. They became quiet, and eventually the empath broke the silence. They created distance, and the empath tried to understand it. That pattern can become so familiar that neither person realizes how much the relationship depends on it. Then one day, the pattern stops. The empath does not send another message. They do not ask why the tone changed. They do not try to repair the distance. They simply stop participating in the cycle. At first, the avoidant may enjoy the quiet, but after some time, the absence itself can become noticeable. Not because silence has some magical power, but because the information they were used to receiving has suddenly disappeared. There used to be a message, now there is nothing. There used to be a reaction, now there is nothing. There used to be an emotional response waiting on the other side of their withdrawal. Now there is no response at all. And slowly, a question can appear in the mind that was not there before. Why are they so quiet? The interesting part is that the question may not begin with love. It may begin with uncertainty. Why have they not reached out? Why are they not asking what happened? Why are they not trying to fix this? Why does the silence feel different this time? That difference matters because silence does not become psychologically meaningful simply because one person disappears. It becomes meaningful when the disappearance breaks an established pattern. If someone always comes back after an argument and suddenly does not, the other person has lost their ability to predict what comes next. If someone always responds emotionally and suddenly becomes calm, the emotional rules of the relationship have changed. The avoidant may have been comfortable with distance when distance was something they could control. They could step back when things became intense. They could take time. They could create space. But when the other person also steps back, the experience becomes different. Now they are not simply choosing distance, they are experiencing another person's decision to create distance, and that can introduce a level of uncertainty they were not prepared for. This is where the old emotional pattern begins to break. In many demand-withdraw dynamics, one person's pursuit can increase the other person's withdrawal, while the withdrawal can then increase the first person's pursuit. It becomes a loop. One person feels disconnected and reaches for reassurance. The other feels pressured and creates more distance. The first person experiences that distance as rejection and reaches harder. The second person experiences the increased pursuit as even more pressure and withdraws further. Neither person necessarily wakes up and decides to create this cycle. It can develop gradually through repeated interactions. The empath may believe that more communication will solve the problem. The avoidant may believe that more space will solve the problem. Both are trying to regulate discomfort, but they are using opposite strategies. Then the empath stops. This is the moment when the emotional system loses one of its main reactions. There is no more pursuit to respond to. There is no emotional pressure to escape. There is no repeated attempt to restore closeness. The avoidant is left with the relationship in a quieter form, but this quietness can eventually become harder to ignore because there is no longer another person carrying the emotional responsibility of keeping the connection alive. And this is where curiosity can begin replacing certainty. When the empath was always available, the avoidant may not have needed to question whether that availability would continue. It was simply there. But human beings often notice patterns most clearly when those patterns disappear. A person can become accustomed to someone's presence without fully appreciating what that presence was providing. The daily message becomes normal. The emotional support becomes normal. The person who listens becomes normal. The person who forgives becomes normal. The person who checks in becomes normal. Then suddenly, normal disappears. That absence creates a blank space, and the mind naturally begins trying to understand the blank space. Maybe they are angry. Maybe they are tired. Maybe they have moved on. Maybe they have met someone else. Maybe they finally stopped caring. Maybe they are waiting for me to reach out. Maybe they really are finished this time. Notice how different these questions are from the initial feeling of relief. The emotional pressure may have disappeared, but now uncertainty has entered the picture. The avoidant may begin thinking about possibilities they never needed to consider while the empath was constantly available, and this is one of the lesser-known parts of the dynamic. Sometimes people do not recognize the emotional importance of access until access is no longer guaranteed. The empath's biggest change is not necessarily that they physically disappear. Their deeper change is that they stop offering unlimited emotional access. The person who once listened to every explanation is no longer automatically available. The person who once responded to every withdrawal is no longer rushing to repair it. The person who once made it easy for the avoidant to return without addressing what happened may no longer provide that same emotional doorway. This does not mean the empath is becoming cruel. It means the relationship is no longer being maintained by one person's constant emotional effort, and this is where the title becomes more meaningful. When an empath goes silent, the avoidant may first feel the loss of access before they fully understand the loss of the person. That distinction matters. Missing someone and noticing the loss of their emotional availability are not exactly the same experience. Someone can miss the comfort, attention, patience, reassurance, or emotional safety that another person provided before they fully understand the depth of the relationship itself. This does not mean the avoidant was intentionally using the empath. It means human beings can become accustomed to emotional resources that another person provides. The empath may have been the person who understood moods without demanding explanations. They may have noticed subtle changes. They may have offered another chance. They may have stayed patient through periods of emotional distance. They may have made the relationship feel recoverable, even after difficult moments. When that person stops doing those things, the relationship can suddenly feel very different. There is less emotional cushioning. There is less certainty that another conversation will happen. There is less confidence that the same person will always be standing at the same emotional door, and eventually the mind may begin returning to memories. Distance can create space for reflection because the constant flow of new interactions has been interrupted. When there are no new messages to process, old conversations can become more mentally available. The avoidant may remember the patience they once took for granted. They may remember conversations they ended too quickly. They may remember moments when the empath was trying to understand rather than attack. They may remember how often the empath returned after being hurt. They may even begin comparing the silence with the emotional presence they once had. But this is important. It would be inaccurate to say that every avoidant will suddenly romanticize the past. Attachment patterns are not formulas, and people respond differently. Some may reflect. Some may distract themselves. Some may continue avoiding the emotions entirely. Some may reach out. Others may not. The psychological point is not that silence guarantees a specific reaction. The point is that changing the pattern changes the emotional information available to both people. The empath is no longer communicating through pursuit, and the avoidant is no longer receiving the same reassurance that the empath will always return. That can create a different kind of mental tension. The avoidant may eventually face a question that was easier to avoid when the empath was still emotionally available. What if they are actually done? That question introduces something more serious than ordinary missing. It introduces finality. Before the silence, the relationship may have felt recoverable. There was always another message, another explanation, another opportunity, another moment when the empath might soften and return. But when that pattern disappears, the possibility of permanent change becomes more real. And this is where the emotional experience can reverse. The empath once lived with uncertainty. They wondered what the avoidant was feeling. They wondered why the distance appeared. They wondered whether the connection mattered. They wondered whether another message would help. Now the avoidant may begin experiencing a different form of uncertainty. They do not know what the empath is thinking. They do not know whether the silence is temporary. They do not know whether the person has emotionally moved on. They do not know whether the old relationship pattern will return. The person who once felt certain that distance would not end the relationship may suddenly discover that distance has consequences. Yet this is exactly why silence should never be treated as a psychological trick. Silence does not guarantee that someone will chase you. It does not prove that they secretly love you. It does not mean every emotionally distant person is avoidant, and it should never be used to punish someone or force a reaction. Healthy silence and manipulative silence are very different. One comes from emotional regulation and self-respect. The other is designed to create fear, confusion, or control. If the empath becomes silent only to provoke the avoidant into chasing them, the emotional attachment to the outcome is still there. The person may be quiet on the outside while constantly checking whether the other person has noticed. But when the silence comes from genuine emotional exhaustion and a decision to stop abandoning oneself, something different happens. The empath is no longer asking, "How can I make this person understand my value?" They are beginning to ask, "Why am I continuing to give so much to a connection that keeps leaving me emotionally uncertain?" That is a completely different psychological position. The empath does not need to become cold. They do not need to become cruel. They do not need to learn manipulation. They simply stop reacting to every withdrawal. They stop explaining every feeling. They stop chasing every unanswered question. They stop treating another person's emotional distance as a problem that they alone must solve. And that is why the silence can feel different when it is real. There is a major difference between saying, "I am silent because I want you to chase me," and reaching a place where the silence means, "I no longer need to convince you to choose me." The first is still centered on the avoidance reaction. The second is centered on the empath's own emotional boundaries. That shift can change the entire dynamic. For a long time, the empath may have carried the uncertainty. They waited, they analyzed, they searched for meaning. They tried to understand. They gave the relationship another chance. They believed that if they communicated clearly enough, loved deeply enough, or remained patient long enough, the emotional distance might finally disappear. But when they stop doing that, the avoidant may suddenly encounter the uncertainty that the empath had been carrying for so long. Not necessarily the exact same feeling, and not necessarily with the same intensity, but a version of the same unanswered space. The person who once controlled when closeness happened may discover that closeness is no longer waiting for their decision. And this is where the emotional balance changes. The empath's silence does not punish the avoidant. It simply stops protecting the avoidant from the natural consequences of emotional distance. When someone repeatedly steps away, there eventually comes a point when the other person may stop following. When someone repeatedly avoids difficult conversations, there eventually comes a point when the other person may stop asking for one. When someone repeatedly assumes that emotional access will always remain available, there eventually comes a point when that access may no longer exist in the same form. That is not revenge. It is a change in participation. And once the old pattern is gone, both people have to face the relationship without the familiar roles they once played. The empath is no longer the one constantly reaching. The avoidant is no longer receiving the same predictable pursuit. The silence therefore becomes more than an absence of words. It becomes evidence that the relationship itself has changed. And for the avoidant, that change may be difficult to understand at first, because the silence does not arrive with an argument. There may be no dramatic final message. No long explanation, no emotional confrontation, just less access, less reaction, less pursuit, less certainty. That quiet shift can be much harder to interpret because there is nothing obvious to fight against. There is no argument to win, and no accusation to defend. There is simply a person who used to be emotionally available and is no longer operating from the same place. That is when the silence can begin to speak in a way that words never did, because the old emotional pattern is no longer there to hide behind. When an empath goes silent, the avoidant feels this first. Conclusion. When an empath goes silent, the avoidant does not always feel heartbreak first. They may not suddenly break down, panic, or realize everything in one moment. What they may feel first is much quieter and much more revealing. They feel the change. They feel the disruption of a pattern that once seemed normal. First came the relief, then came the absence, then the unanswered questions, then the uncertainty, and slowly, the realization that the person who was always there may no longer be available in the same way. The messages they expected do not arrive. The explanations they depended on disappear. The emotional door they always knew how to walk through is no longer standing open. And that is when the meaning of silence begins to change. It is no longer simply about not speaking. It becomes a reminder that access to another person's heart is never guaranteed. But the most important part of this story is not what happens inside the avoidant. It is what happens inside the empath. Because the goal was never to make someone chase you. It was never to create fear. It was never to use silence as a punishment. The real transformation happens when the empath finally stops chasing someone who keeps creating distance. They stop asking for the same explanation. They stop proving their loyalty. They stop trying to earn basic emotional consistency. They stop confusing patience with self-abandonment. And perhaps that is the deepest revelation of all. The empath does not become powerful because the avoidant finally misses them. The empath becomes powerful when being missed is no longer the reason they stay. Their silence is not a weapon. It is a boundary. It is not revenge. It is acceptance. It is the quiet moment when they finally understand that love should not require them to constantly abandon themselves. Sometimes the loudest message is not an argument. It is the absence of the person who used to explain everything, forgive everything, and keep coming back. And when that person finally becomes quiet, the relationship can no longer survive on the old pattern. The question is no longer, why don't you choose me? The question becomes, why was I so willing to keep choosing someone who would not meet me halfway? That question can change everything. So if this video helped you understand the hidden psychology behind an empath's silence and the avoidance reaction, do not leave without subscribing to the channel. Subscribe for more deep insights into attachment, human behavior, emotional patterns, and relationship psychology. If this message connected with something you have experienced, give this video a like because it helps this message reach more people who may need to hear it. and share it with someone who is trying to understand why silence can sometimes mean much more than words ever could. Because sometimes, the moment you stop explaining your worth is the moment you finally begin living as if you already know it.